My family used to be that family in the neighborhood. The folks from whom you could expect a house and yard exploding with lights and decorations that could be seen from space every holiday season. That level of commitment inspired everyone around us to join in. People came from miles around to take photos of the neighborhood with clunky 35mm cameras long before smartphones were a thing. I'm fully aware of how special that kind of situation is when there are so many neighbors who would scoff at seeing anything more than a single strand of bland white lights strung together across the gutter of the garage and view the holidays as a time of being inundated by someone else's tackiness. I grew up with the good fortune of neighbors who never complained and instead participated wholeheartedly every year. I also had a mom who was determined to make Christmas a magical and memorable experience. I used to live for what are collectively referred to as the Burrs, that 4-month period from September to December during which nothing occupied my mind quite like the imminent arrival of Halloween and Christmas. The Burrs would become my family's time to shine growing up. My mom designed and built most of the pieces in our display, and as I got older, I was full of my own ideas and carried around notebooks full of crazed drawings that Mom would very lovingly examine and consider every time I showed her one. The strain of patience that such consideration took was more evident on her face when she was confronted by these thoughts of Yuletide delight in the middle of July. I would listen to Christmas music in the middle of summer just because I loved and looked forward to everything about the later portion of the year. I also hated summer as much as I loved Christmas. There were a few years where we didn't decorate, and it was purely out of spite. Another family in the neighborhood had gotten jealous when we were featured on the front page of the local paper, and their house was entirely overlooked, resulting in them descending on the yard in the middle of the night. Their tour of destruction was heard in the night and later revealed in the morning, and at 7 years old, I cried like my heart was broken, because it was. It was my first lesson in the devastating impact that someone else's reckless disregard for others can have on you. It would not be my last. The one thing I loved more than anything else about the holidays was those decorations. Nothing stirred my soul quite like seeing tiny multicolored lights strung up and laid over everything. It wasn't uncommon to see me crying when it all had to come down. A major lesson in my experience with grief is that nothing feels the same after the person you most often enjoyed and shared everything with is gone. Even decorating for a once favored time of year isn't the same since losing my mom. I was encouraged by my mentor to put up at least one set in my bedroom because he felt the lights were a resourceful way of staving off depression. Everything else sits in the storage barn out back, waiting for life to be more bearable. A lady in my neighborhood came over the year after the loss of my mom and said, "Doesn't this all make you sad?" What she was referring to was the several families who had turned that particular weekend into a Christmas display setup party. Families wandered from one house to another, exchanging drinks, snacks, compliments, and extension cords. The neighborhood tradition had managed to continue while I swept the garage of a house that no longer felt like a home. When she came over to inquire about my fragile sensibilities, it was because the house and the yard remained dark the year my mom was taken before her time, and out of heartbreak and a recognition of justice not yet attained, I have fully committed to abstaining from decorating ever since. That decision has provided its own lesson on grief, primarily how people can't seem to fucking stand it. It's worth recognizing that people reaching out is not something to be discouraged. I would be fine with that if that was what they were actually doing. Grieving during the holidays is like putting a spotlight on yourself. Even when you're the introverted type like me who has to be dragged out of the house, you manage to draw attention to yourself without even trying. People you know will come out of the woodwork and try to coax you over for Thanksgiving. The response out loud is a very polite, "That is so thoughtful, but no thank you." The response in your head is an instinct to run screaming in the opposite direction. When Thanksgiving doesn't work out the way they thought, they will hijack any conversation to remind you about your own holiday traditions, thinking this is helpful instead of hurtful. They'll tell you that they want you to decorate because it's something they know you need to do to move on, and that it will help you in some vague and not well explained way. It took a couple years, but I realized that this behavior has an underlying motive, and it's not out of the goodness of anyone's heart, harsh though that may sound. It's not about them wanting to gently ease you through the difficulty of this period in your life, nor the discomfort. It's more about reducing the amount of discomfort that there is for them. They want you to come to dinner or put up the tree or throw some lights on the bushes because they can't stand to see your utter lack of participation and be reminded that good things don't last, and that there are times in life when your heart just is not in things the way that it was before. The journey you're on is one that they've either not experienced or didn't take quite as hard as you have, and the difference in experience and approach is hard for them to process, so they do what they can to make that discomfort go away. To answer that lady's question, no, it doesn't make me sad to see other people still able to feel something that I no longer do, but it clearly does make you uncomfortable to see that I'm okay with sitting out this season of the year entirely. I want people to have a truly happy holiday if they find that they're able to do so, and the issue should not be forced on them. What did she expect? For me to be shaking my fist from the front yard, outraged that people had the nerve to be merry around me in my time of grieving? As my therapist and I concluded after I told him about this interaction, yes, that would in fact make me the asshole in that situation. And I get it. Coming from the family that lived in what was commonly referred to as the Christmas house by anyone who lived in a several-mile radius of my neighborhood, I used to not understand people who openly bemoaned the approach of the holidays. I couldn't understand how there could be a stretch of dark and undecorated houses in any given neighborhood, while other people had decorated to the max. Where was their sense of joy and their festive spirit? This is the epitome of ignorance being a form of bliss. Because the thing about trauma and grief is that when things settle and you come out of the initial shock of it all, you suddenly have what amounts to emotional X-ray vision. You no longer see the dark house devoid of festive flourish. You see that one person through the window sitting quietly inside late in the evening. You know they're recovering from having struggled through another day because you've lost track of the number of days where you came home and laid on the floor for an hour before even considering walking to the shower because the amount of overwhelm that you walked through the door with needed to be processed first. When someone grimaces at Judy Garland singing "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas" while picking up the groceries, it's not because they're resentful. It's because they don't know if this will be the day and the moment where they completely break down, and they'd rather not have the added pressure to fight against the urge to fall to their knees in the middle of the dairy aisle. So I refuse to be pious and preach against the commercialism of the season. We've all watched A Charlie Brown Christmas, and nothing really changed other than A Charlie Brown Christmas getting spun off into merchandise that gets snatched up every year along with everything else material. Besides, the message of giving experiences instead of things typically feels disingenuous, because that sneering judgment mostly comes from wealthy white women on morning shows and influencer accounts who conveniently fail to mention that the experiences they give their children are luxury trips to faraway places which most of us would struggle to afford much more than we would some toys from Target. I want people to go crazy with lights and decorations, and I don't want their neighbors giving them a hard time about any of it. Instead of those neighbors saying, "Do you really have to do so much?" I'd like them to ask if their neighbors need a hand, because it's a project that is time-consuming and laborious and means the world to them to get it all up. Just months after my mom's passing, I met a guy who understood having a massive Christmas display and also understood loss. He revealed that his teenage nephew had been murdered. The killer secured a plea deal and didn't stay in jail long, and this grieving uncle had just been diagnosed with multiple forms of cancer, and all his own son could say was, "What are you leaving me in the will?" He decided that life had been cruel enough. He wasn't going through with treatment, and his last year of life would include putting up every last thing he could from his Christmas display and enjoying it for as long as he possibly could, because at least there was still that source of happiness in what was left of his life. When the Christmas music starts playing, I don't want people to groan or roll their eyes, because despite the fact that I stopped listening to music at all when I lost my mom, I certainly don't object to it. I want somebody to crank that shit up and let people sing the songs of comfort and joy with sincere appreciation, and I hope they'll remember to take nothing for granted, because there are people like me for whom comfort and joy are things that can't be felt anymore.